Welcome to the Susan Brender Show. It's all about you. Featuring shows on health and wellness, the performing arts, politics, and people who inspire you to be your very best. And now, here's Susan Brender.
I'm Susan Brender, and this is the Susan Brender Show. Today I have a very interesting man on my show by the name of Pactor. He's been a teacher for 50 years and a professional storyteller and a speaker for another 30 years now. He's also written a fabulous book called Daniel, the Age of Discovery, and he's now in the process of writing another one, which is all just for teenagers. It's called Thoughts to Hold On To, Just for Teenagers. So I want to welcome to my show Pactor.
Thank you, Susan.
You know, Peter, I want to know, when did you realize that you wanted to be a writer?
That's a good question, but I think it was about 10 years old that my cousin and I, who's also a writer, sat down and started parodying poetry. And I think that was the beginning of the writing. But I've always had that urge. And when you read good literature, as I have through my education, I think it grows on you. Now, but I had something to say when I wrote these books.
Okay, we'll get into that in a moment. But first I want to know, so when you were a kid, did your parents introduce you to books, or was it your teachers? Because very often children don't read enough, and they don't have the advantage of having somebody motivate them to read, to write, to do all kinds of things. So who do you attribute to helping you to become a really good writer?
It was probably my parents. I can't remember a time. You meant readers, what you asked me? A writer.
Writer, yeah.
Yeah.
And readers.
You asked me about Peter, yes. It's my parents who probably influenced me. I can't remember a time when I didn't read. So I read comic books, of course, and Mad Magazine, but I read a lot of books. And particularly, I liked the landmark books. They were written just for kids, and they're historical, and I read them through middle school. I actually worked in the library when I was in middle school, junior high school.
Working in a library, that was probably very interesting for you because you saw all the books that were on the shelves, and did they draw you? Oh, you know what I want to tell you? Do you remember The Twilight Zone?
Of course, yes.
Well, do you remember the episode about some man who his only dream was to be able to read every single book in the library? So his dream comes true. The whole world is ended, and he's the only one left. And what happens is that he's in this library, and he looks around, and suddenly his glasses fall off, and he steps on them. And that's the most horrendous thing, because now he can't read. So my question to you is, if you didn't have books available to you, what would you do?
That is really a tough question because I like to read. I don't like technology so much, so I'm not on TV. I'd rather read than watch TV, and I'd rather read than be on the computer. I like writing. It's exciting. But probably I would pursue more activity with my banjo. Oh,
now you play the banjo?
Well, I call it that, but sometimes other people don't.
Okay, all right. So what is it about the banjo that, I'm going to use the expression turns you on? What is it about it?
Oh, when I was a kid, I loved listening to the banjo. It was such a happy sound. It's hard to play blues on the banjo, I think. So the music always sounds happy. I liked it. But when I got my banjo, my mother gave me my first banjo when I was 17 of 1961 for Christmas. And I still have it. The banjo was already old. It was probably over 100 years old, but there was no one to teach me. You know, hardly anyone played the banjo in those days, at least not in the city I was living in. And so I got Pete Seeger's book, but it ended up being self-taught. Once I learned the chords, I could play and sing, and that was a lot of fun.
Mm.
And I grew up in the folk generation.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about that. Was it different in your generation than it is now when it comes to education? So many people, I mean, all these kids are on the computer. They're messaging all the time. They're going on their iPads, their iPods. That's all they do. I mean, all the time. Does that work against the principle that reading helps you write, helps you learn a lot of things?
Well, you're asking me a couple questions at the same time. First of all, I have a friend who says that if you can read, you can learn anything. And I think that's true. But in the past 5 years, up till maybe 5 years ago, I would have said that the kids hadn't changed at all in the 45 years I'd been teaching. But with the advent of the smartphone, I think it has changed the kids a lot. They certainly know a lot more than I did, but their knowledge is unorganized. And what they're losing with their iPhones is the ability to communicate with one another face to face. They're not good at reading body languages. They can't go without answering the phone. The kids say, "I can't get my work done." I said, "Give your phone to your parents." Because right. I know as soon as someone texts them or calls them, they're on the phone and it's taken away from their study time. It's doing some real damage. I was teaching speech a few years ago, and the kids come up with impromptu topics. So one of my seniors, got the topic to talk about technology and talked about his cell phone. And one of the things he said, when I and my friends go out for dinner, we put our cell phones in the middle of the table, and the first one to reach for his pays. And I thought that was a good response.
Yeah. So they become entrepreneurs, huh?
Well, yes, they can. They can do a lot. They have more resources and more information available to them today than they've ever had. And I think, in part, that you've brought this up, I think the way we teach needs to change.
Yeah.
And as you read my book, the real people who are in my book are self-educated and self-made men. And there's nothing wrong with that. And I think sometimes we have to get rid of standardized tests and the idea of cramming the kids with knowledge without giving them a chance to think about what they're learning and take the emphasis off grades and let the kids ask questions about things they're interested in and leave the curriculum. If someone's interested in something that's like in history, I had a situation where the kids were studying guilds, and one of the kids asked me, and so we left the text and we talked about guilds, and I started a project for them. I said, I'll tell you what it was. I said that if this is such a good idea, we should probably just write people in the area you're interested in, because we don't have guilds in the United States, although there's some in Europe. And I said, this is such a good idea, we're going to do it. So I had them write a letter. I told them they could not put in there was a school project, and they had to show me the letters first. Well, I didn't even think about them not being able to write a letter. They didn't know how to write a letter.
No.
And when I thought about it,
Peter, and not only did they not know how to write a letter, as I said before, technology rules. When they get on the computer and they write, say, an email, they don't even have to think about spelling. They don't even need to think about different aspects of the grammar, because the computer does everything for them. So, it's a horrendous thing that we're going through. Which leads me, before you continue, which leads me to, what would you say is your interesting writing quirk? I mean, because I read your book and I find it very interesting. But what's the writing quirk that makes your book different?
Well, that's a really good question. First of all, I retired last year after 50 years because I just physically couldn't do it anymore. But I still had things I wanted to teach. And the question is, how was I going to present that? And I chose to do it through a novel. And some of the authors I really enjoy reading. Now, say that a lot of my reading has been in foreign language, in German, Latin, and French, because that's what I studied. But I have authors that teach in their books, and the idea is to be subtle enough, which some of them are. Goethe is certainly one, and Schiller certainly another, who are very subtle about teaching. Bert Brecht, who wrote the Threepenny Opera, and that's where Mac the Knife comes from, his work. He almost hits you over the head with what he's trying to explain. But that's what I did. I chose to teach again.
Yeah. So how would you explain, the reason for your book? I mean, you're talking about Goethe. You're talking about revolutionaries. I mean, writers that are amazing. So you said just now, that there's something in your imagination, I suppose, in your imagination. Where does that come from?
That I have no idea. The creative process for me is kind of a mystery. I knew when I started the book that I wanted to cover from end of 1928 to the crash, and I didn't get there because what I find in all my creative work, and I paint as well, that if you give it time, and especially in writing, the characters take over, and you can't have them do something that they wouldn't do. They're characters, so even though I still have this goal to get to the crash, the characters have been driving it.
I see. Okay,
does that make any sense?
It sure does. Now, do you have the book in front of you?
I have a copy in front of me,
Okay,
yes.
Go to the author's notes.
At the back, okay.
Okay, I want you to read...
Give me a second, because I have my hands full here.
Okay.
All right, the author's notes in back.
That's right.
Okay.
So I would like you to read the first paragraph, or you can just read a little bit more. Okay, if you would.
The first paragraph?
Yes.
Yeah, even though this book is fiction, I have introduced several historical figures into the action. None of their encounters in the story ever took place, however. The information about these men is accurate to the best of my knowledge. All
right. So now let's, that is one of the quirks of this book, as far as I'm concerned. So where do you get the information or ideas for this book?
About the people?
Well, about the people and just in general. How did you decide to write Daniel, the Age of Discovery? You must have had an idea in the back of your mind.
Well, I tell you, the idea, what I wanted to teach was the lessons that appear in him. There's a lot of them, actually. The people I read, and I read biographies, and I've read some other books about the crash. I like this period from 1929 to 1945. I think it's maybe the greatest time in American history. And so I read them, and when I start reading, then one thing leads to another. I read a book, and there's a character I want to look up because he sounds interesting. This Jesse Livermore was just absolutely fascinating to me, and I read his biography 4 times in the first year I had it. And so I find them, and I want to know what makes them tick, and I found out Roger Babson, who most people don't know Livermore Babson today, and he was fascinating. I read his autobiography, but I got their names actually from reading. I've got it in front of me. It's called The Great Crash by John Kenneth Galbraith, which is an incredible book, and I've read it 3 or 4 times. And so I come across his name. I'm reading a book now on the World's Fair of 1939, which is reasonably interesting. And I didn't know who Grover Wayland was, and he was like Mr. New York when he was alive, and he built the World's Fair. He was a promoter. He promoted himself. That's the main thing he promoted. But so I said, well, I just got his biography. I ordered his biography, so I wanted to read that.
Would books like that resonate with young people today?
They could. As I've been doing this, I just love the learning process that I'm going through. I said, I don't know why you can't teach this way. If a kid is interested in something, then let's pursue it and let's find out other things that are relevant. So a teacher would probably have to be well educated. He's not going to have a class of 30 people, but they could all work individually, and they'd have different projects to do. So I'm reading about the stock market, and in this case, I read books that I never would have read, and they've turned out interesting. One was Banking Reform from 1920 to 1929. Yeah. And Irving Fisher wrote I'll tell you who Irving Fisher is, I should say. He was maybe the celebrity economist before the crash.
Oh, boy.
And shortly before the crash, he said that the stock market has reached a permanently high plateau. So when the market crashed, he was discredited, but he wrote a dissertation on the crash and depressions, the causes. I already figured most of them out before I read his dissertation, but it was a good dissertation. Well, he was an influence for someone you'll remember, Milton Friedman.
Sure.
And Milton Friedman was perhaps a celebrity economist when we were young.
Correct. Now, okay, so all of these books, all of the people that you're speaking of, they're historical figures.
Yes.
Are the historical figures accepted, and are they interesting to a lot of people? Because I have a suspicion that people don't know. I mean, they don't know these names, and they don't really research or find their books. I mean, now it's so different. Our world is so different. So what do you attribute to the fact that something turned you on to these things, and most of the people around you, do they like it too?
The books?
Yeah.
Well, my teenager at home doesn't read much. He's on the cell phone, but my Latin students, they were readers, and some of them would read 100 or more books a year. I mean, they're avid readers, and I was blessed to be teaching Latin throughout my teaching experience, and they read solid books. But what I found mostly with kids outside of my Latin students, that most of them didn't read that much, and when they do read, they don't read biographies, and they don't. And the sad thing for me is they don't learn the stories of American history, for example, and what made this country great. They don't even know who Benjamin Franklin was, other than he was a patriot in the Revolution, or maybe flew his kite about electricity. But he was the most famous person in the world, and he also started with nothing and became the wealthiest man in America.
Now, Peter, let's jump a little forward. So the next book that you're writing is called Thoughts to Hold Onto, just for teenagers. And you say at the beginning of the book that you were, well, let me read it. Okay, so this is kind of an introduction to you again. Peter Pactor was born and raised in Indiana. After receiving an A.B. from Wabash College and an M.A. from Washington University, he's been a teacher and an administrator in junior high school and senior high schools. He's also founded and directed the Academic Success Center, a program for underachievers. Okay, that is a very interesting thing. Let's talk about the Academic Success Center. Where did it start, and were you the person who started it?
I was, and I started it for my son. My kids are adopted, and I'm really proud of my son in this story. If you have time for it, it's a really good story.
Go ahead.
When he and his sister moved in with us, they were 10 and 11, and so they were older kids. And Doug was in the 4th grade and couldn't read at 1st grade level. So my wife was good. She worked with him on reading, but in the 7th grade, they built this new, we were in Denver, they built this new school, it was open classroom. And I went up and I said, well, my son cannot function here. And he said, essentially, that's too bad. I mean, that was kind of the reaction. That's like 1978, I think, 79. And so he failed everything in 7th grade. Then we moved to Chattanooga, where he was placed in a class with kids who had special needs. And at the end of the year, they put him into a regular class. He was going to go into the 9th grade the next year. I said, if something's not done for Doug, he's not going to make it through high school. So I had this program in mind. I started this program with just Doug and another girl. And, of course, I mean, this never happens with other people's children, but every time I try to help Doug, he'd yell at me. But the girl who was with us would laugh at him, which was, I didn't have to deal with it because that was worse than anything I could say or do. And he had his best year ever in 9th grade. And his sophomore year was even better. And his junior and senior year, he was on honor roll. And then he graduated from high school, and then he did nothing. I'm not exaggerating this. He did nothing for 12 years, and I didn't think he'd ever do anything. He called me up one night and said, I'm going back to school, and he went back to school, and he graduated from Faulkner State in Alabama, magna cum laude.
Wow. Now, hold on. This is a great story. So let's delve into this a bit. So there are a lot of kids who graduate high school, and then they're lost because they're told, and they're told usually that you graduate from high school, you go to college. No guilds, no opportunity to learn a craft. And so when they go to college, some of them study sociology, psychology, communications, but there's not enough jobs, and as a result, they fall through the cracks. So my question to you is, if you had to change the way people organize their lives, you mentioned before you wanted guilds. Now, I want you to tell our audience, what is a guild?
Well, a guild in the Middle Ages was a period was a process in which, if you wanted to learn a trade, because all trades were handicrafts, they were handcrafts. If you wanted to learn a trade, that you go study with a master, say a master brewer, and you did all this work for maybe 7 or 8 years until you learned the trade. Then you became an apprentice or a journeyman. I mean, you became a journeyman, which you could practice, but you couldn't have your own place. And then after you did that for a while, you got your master. You became a master, whatever it was.
Right, and you like that a lot, don't you?
The guilds, it's interesting and to me, but it's not what drives me. It's not. It's just a side note.
So you opened yourself up. So what drives you?
I'm pretty altruistic. I do things. First of all, I'm told I'm a contrarian. I don't go along with everything else that people do. I always have done what I thought was right. It doesn't always work out that way, but sometimes that's been my process. And I teach because I can help kids. And I'm out of school now and retired, and I'm still doing things that will help kids. I feel that it will help kids.
Okay.
And so that's my motivation. I do things because they're enjoyable and I can be helpful. I adopted my last child at 65. You can't imagine the grief I got about adopting a child at 65 when I started the process.
Why would people care about that? Wouldn't they be, wouldn't they look at you and say, you're a great guy to do something like that?
Well, they just thought I was too old to deal with a teenager and you be with parents who are a lot younger. But, I never found that to be a problem. Mm-hmm. And
what about the kid? I bet they love you.
Well, I hope so. But, being you're a parent, so, it's not always a bed of roses.
Of course. And
So it's always a struggle, and if you want them to learn correctly. But what I did this for was because my first lesson in all my classes for the last 10, 20 years has been I am responsible for my life, and we talk about this, and it's in my book. What this means. It means that if you make good decisions, you get good consequences, and you make bad decisions, you get bad consequences. And because I believed in this, I decided that I would take another kid and give him a chance, because kids who are in foster care, especially the boys, 80% of them end up in jail afterwards. In Texas, of our homeless population, 75% of the homeless population are from foster care. And that's not just in Texas, but I know that's true in Texas, and I think it's also true in New York City.
Right.
But it's a pretty high percentage. So the kids who go through foster care don't have much of a chance.
Right.
And I felt, because I believe in this, I can say, I can do this. And I've been teaching I am responsible for my life to him. He's got all the words. He doesn't always have the right. Doesn't always make the right decisions, but that's part of growing up.
Yeah.
He's really a good kid.
Okay, so let's move again to something that you wrote. It's in the introduction to Thoughts to Hold On To Just for Teenagers. Do you have that in front of you as well?
I do. Now, this is the earlier edition. The new one is at the printers, and it's the expanded edition of this. But go ahead.
Well, let me. I want you to read it, okay? And you start by saying, "To my young friends." Okay, so
right.
What do you say?
40 years ago, when I was your age, it was hard to be a teenager, but I don't think it was as difficult as it is today. I have wondered for some time what the difference has been, and perhaps as I have passed my mid-century mark, I have realized that difference. When I was a teenager, we had fewer choices. There were things we were allowed to do and things we weren't allowed to do. There were no shades of gray. Whatever our parents told us was proper was also supported by what we saw in the media and listened to in our music. Everywhere we went, the message was the same. The expectations for us in our schools, in our places of worship, and in our community were the same as at home. Unfortunately, today, you have been lied to by so many different elements in our society that you have been left to make important decisions for yourself with inexperienced years of your youth. In Thoughts to Hold On To, I have phone in one hand, the book in the other. In Thoughts to Hold On To, I have tried to share some life lessons with you to help you make some of the decisions that have been left in your hands. Okay,
so this is a good chance to just give our audience a chance to listen to one of the lessons, and I guess you can choose. It's about adolescence or anger or appreciation.
Well, I tell you, I on my website, peterpactor.net, I don't know if you found that or not, but I've been putting, because the new edition is coming out, I've been putting I put one of these on the website, and the other one, and I'm going to put another one like once a month from the original copy. Okay, so I chose the back of the book. Is When Your World's Out of Whack. I think this is a good one. Sometimes it seems that our world is out of whack and that nothing is going right. We feel trapped and can't see a way out. Bad things happen, but it is usually our attitude about them that causes us the most problems. Although we can't stop bad things from happening, we can control our response. When bad things happen, ask yourself if you can do anything about it. If you can, do it. If not, forget it and go on with your life. There's no point in worrying about things you can't control. Napoleon always waited a month to open his mail because he knew that with time, most problems resolve themselves. Besides, most of the many things we worry about never happen, and many of the bad things that do happen to us turn out to be blessings after the passing of time. The important thing is to control your attitude. There's an old Chinese proverb, you can't keep the birds from flying over your head, but you can keep them from making a nest in your hair. And at the bottom I have a thought in bold type. When your world seems really out of whack, get your attitude right, and you will get your world right.
Interesting words. Now, did you play this by some kids, or did you play this by your family, and what did they think about it?
I don't even know. Ask me that question again. Will you rephrase it?
Yeah, here you're writing these very wonderful words of wisdom. So I just want to know if you've played this by your kids. I mean, you have a lot of kids, and were they the subject of this? And if you and what about your family? How did they feel about it when they read these words?
Well, they liked it. In fact, I'm just human as the next person. There may be some argument there, but I feel I am. And I've been told when I've gotten upset about something, read your book.
There you go.
Especially for my brother. But I do this, and this book, the original, has been really handy. It was so difficult to market back in the 90s because I'd had to go from bookstore to bookstore. It sold well, but it just, it wasn't worth my time to do it. So I have done with this book is when kids have come to class and they had problems, I would say, see me after class, and I'd give them a copy of my book, and I said, don't tell kids I gave it to you because I don't want them coming asking, say, I gave you a book, why can't I have one? Mm-hmm. I just saved them for kids who are having problems, and it's been very good. I had one a boy last year who I don't even know what his problems were, and I gave him the book, and one day he came in and just hugged me. And so it's meaningful, mm-hmm. and I think it's valuable for kids.
Right. How did you get your books published?
I'm sorry?
How did you get your books published?
This one, my earlier ones,
all of them,
or the current ones.
The current ones.
They're being published by Friesen Press. Mm-hmm. And I've chosen to self-publish. There are a lot of reasons for doing that, but one is that I have 100% control over the process, mm-hmm. and Friesen Press has access to 35,000 outlets.
Wow.
So with electronic publishing, it's not as difficult to market your book. You can just do an e-book, but when you're talking at Amazon and you go look at it, they have probably over 10 million books on Amazon. Mm-hmm. So it's hard. The hard part is getting it out there so people will know it's there.
Yeah. All right. So my guest today has been Peter Pactor. Now, Peter, I always like to give my author the last words. So what would you want our audience to take away from this conversation?
Well, first of all, I hope they're interested enough to read the books because I think there's a lot of value to them. And that's important to me. I wrote this book to help people, both my books. There's a lot of meat in Daniel, the Age of Discovery. It's laid out very simply for teenagers and thoughts to hold on to. It's important to them. They can order the books almost any place online, and the bookstores don't carry it, but that's another story. I chose not to put it in the bookstore as a new author, mm-hmm. but they can order them for you, like Barnes & Noble can order it and have it in. But I think that's what's important. I did this because there's something I wanted to teach, and I thought it was important for people. Mm-hmm. But I will say this, Susan, that it's been interesting to talk to people in the community and people who haven't read my book and who have read my book. I met a fellow at the credit union one day, and we were just talking in line. The line was like a run on the bank. I'd never seen it before. And mm-hmm. I told him about my book. He went out and bought a copy. He actually wrote a review for it. He said, what I told you about meeting in the credit union, and that the book was so good, he's going to buy a paper copy for his nephew.
Wonderful.
And people want to talk about these characters. People who've read the book that I know ask me, what's going to happen in the next book? Mm-hmm. And I'm not telling them, of course.
Of course. Keep it a mystery. Mysteries are good.
But they're excited about it. They want to talk about it. it may start out a little slow when you're reading about Chester Alexander when Daniel's 95. But I think the story is good. The characters are engaging. There's a lot of history. There's a lot of art, literature, and finances, and especially the life lessons. I am responsible for my life is my main lesson.
Right.
People need to learn that.
So do you hear from your readers much? What kind of things do they say?
Well, there are 15 reviews in all between Amazon and Goodreads. And they say it's engaging. They like I am responsible for my life. They like a couple mentioned about praying with a prayer shawl or a blanket over your head and cutting out the rest of the world. They said they're going to try that. There's just a lot for everybody. And adults who read it said, my children are going to read it. I got stopped at school one day last year by a mother, and she said, I've got 3 boys, and they're all going to read your book.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Because it's got values. I have friends who homeschool. They want me to take it to homeschool conventions, and I'm thinking about that. But those are the kind of responses I get, and all the ratings are 4s and 5s on online right now.
Wonderful. So I can't help but asking you this. You just mentioned homeschooling. Nobody, at least I haven't heard people talk about homeschooling in a long time. So I'm interested in knowing what you think about that. And is that a great experience for kids? Because, homeschooling apparently is taught by their parents, and there must be a lot of love and a lot of conviction to get these kids well educated. So would you explain what homeschooling is and how they can use your book?
Well, I think I'm not knowledgeable enough about homeschooling to answer those questions. All I see is the kids I've met who have been homeschooled by their parents come out very good students. The ones I've seen.
Yeah.
And that's all I can say. And one of the things I think, we don't have enough time to talk about education.
Yeah.
But I do talk about it in my book.
Oh, good. Mm-hmm.
Because Daniel is totally self-educated because his parents wouldn't allow him when he was young to have friends his own age or go to school. So they had this big library tower on their estate because his family is exceedingly wealthy. And that's where he learned. And so when he ends up at 12 years old going to boarding school, he doesn't even know what grades are.
Jeez.
And it's interesting. And he brings a lot of changes to the school because of the way he's learned. Of course, he has no social skills when he goes away to boarding school. Mm-hmm. But he's an interesting guy, Daniel is. I like him. Anyway, I like all the characters in my book. But,
see that? Okay, well,
me.
I'm sure that our audience is going to find your book extremely interesting, and probably they're going to love your characters too. So anyway, we've had a wonderful time with talking to Peter Pactor, and Peter Pactor is a person who really understands the mystery of writing, and he's written several books, but his last book was Daniel, the Age of Discovery. So if you want to really have a great experience and learn a lot, I suggest that all of you look for Daniel, the Age of Discovery, and coming up is going to be his book, which is called Thoughts to Hold On To, just for teenagers. Thank you.
And I've also finished his sequel.
Ah, okay.
With Daniel.
Well,
and it's at the publisher also.
Yeah, well, when you finish the sequel, maybe you want to be a guest on my show again. So thank you, Peter Pactor, for being on the Susan Brender Show.
Okay. Thank you, Susan. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the Susan Brender Show. To be a guest, email sebrender@yahoo.com.